Good evening, everyone, and hello to people who might be watching this stream when it's on YouTube. So hi to everyone who's joining us live, and hello to everyone who might be watching this at a later time. Welcome to this stream that we're doing in honor of the International Global Encryption Day. I'm joined by Kee. Kee, wave to the people.
Hey, guys.
And I'm from Digital Rights Watch, and we're going to be talking about all things encryption, law enforcement access, how it works, why it works, what we love about it, why we're frustrated, and yeah, all those dirty deeds. We're going to spend, I think, about 45 minutes here today. We did receive a bunch of questions ahead of time through our form. Thanks for everyone who did that. So we'll be making our way through those. If you have additional questions, you can pop them in the chat. And if it's not something that's already been brought up, we're happy to cover it. But I'm going to try and keep us to time, so I can't promise we'll get to everything. Also, we have a code of conduct. So if you want to get into a fight on Twitter or in the comment section, you will be promptly dealt with. And I suppose that's most of the housekeeping. So expect this to run for about 45 minutes. And we're going to walk our way through, just a whole bunch of different topics. So bear with us. And if there's something that you're not hearing that you want to, you can also always reach out to us. I'm going to have Sam, my colleague, who's kind of overseeing this, share the Twitter handles of our organizations below in the chat. So you guys can reach out also on Twitter if you feel like we haven't done what we needed to do in this conversation and you have more questions. I do want to acknowledge, I am, as you can see by the daylight, I'm in a different time zone entirely these days. But I do want to acknowledge that a lot of this, this event is technically hosted in Australia, and a lot of us are sitting on unceded lands. So we want to acknowledge and pay respects to elders, present, past, and emerging. And a lot of the work we do at Digital Rights Watch is sort of anchored in questioning the systems of surveillance and policing, which unjustly discriminate Indigenous communities. And I think that's up to us to do a lot of the work of decolonizing those structures. So that's something we feel very strongly about. So take a minute to think about where you're sitting and how the surveillance state interplays with that, and feel free to drop where you're tuning in from in the chat as well. We love to hear that, and it's something we try to always be conscious of. That is me in terms of intro. I would like to talk about why encryption is important and some of my work, and then I'll hand it off to Kee a little bit to talk about what encryption is and how it protects us. And then we'll jump into the questions that we received and do a little Q&A. We've lined it up so the questions will emerge at the bottom of the screen. Will be dramatic, so you guys can follow along. I've worked on encryption policy for the better part of the last 7 years. And first it was in Europe at the Brussels level. And then of course it was something that I have worked extensively in extensively in Australia. And it's something that I think law enforcement at one level or another grapples with, that governments at one level or another grapple with. And I think it's really a symptom of the frustrations that governments feel over not being able to control and regulate technology as the state. And that's not just encryption. I think they struggle. You see that kind of through over extensive defamation laws. You see that through, sort of laws that punish people for certain types of content and threaten to imprison executives if companies don't comply. I think it's manifesting and sort of bubbling up in a lot of different places. And I think encryption is one of those places that just gets really flailed because they really struggle to understand the math. Like, I think it was Malcolm Turnbull who said that the laws of mathematics are nice, but they don't apply in Australia when they were trying to undermine encryption at the time. So it's something that they struggle with, but I think it's just one of those sort of issues that gets flailed because technology and the open internet in a really wonderful way is still sort of escaping control and manipulation by governments. Maybe not for long, but for now, it's still a wonderful global resource, and governments who like to control narratives are really frightened of that. So to me, the debate sort of around encryption is one about security, for sure, because primarily, and I think he might want to go into that, but it is really about encryption and securing privacy. But to me, it's also about maintaining the integrity of the global open internet. So that's sort of where the fight sits for me. And I will go into a lot of details on this in the questions, but there's other ways I think that we can go about it without undermining encryption. And that's something, in my experience, that's been very seldom explored. And there does seem to be internal strife even within law enforcement agencies and the government. So encryption constantly under threat because governments feel frustrated. It's important, and the advocacy, I think, will never stop. It never has stopped since the internet and technology became a part of our everyday lives. So I'm really looking forward to living in this weird Groundhog Day for the rest of my existence as a digital rights advocate. But yeah, I think I'll end my little monologue there. And Kee, do you want to talk to us about, what encryption actually technically is and how it protects our communications and data? Maybe just go into that little technical scene setting.
Yeah, definitely. For you guys who haven't met me, my name's Kee, and I work as the CTO on Session, which is a private encrypted messaging application. We sort of focus a lot on encryption, but also on metadata protection as well, which is becoming or has become more and more relevant over the last 5 to 10 years. And a lot of the reason that metadata has become so relevant is because a lot of the internet is encrypted now. When you're accessing this website using HTTPS, which is a secure layer on top of HTTP, which allows you to encrypt with the service you're communicating with directly without the middleman like the ISP or anyone who's on the intermediate route being able to read, what you're accessing necessarily. But that doesn't necessarily mean that, your ISP doesn't know that you're connected to StreamYard or, if you're connected to YouTube or whatever service you're connected to. So we focus a lot more on the metadata side, but fundamentally kind of encryption is basically just translating information. So you'll have a plain text message or data that you want to send, and you'll translate that into a kind of indecipherable string of numbers and letters, which is sent over the internet. And then the person that you're communicating with has a special key, which is able to translate that information back into a readable format for them to be able to process and consume. I think where it kind of gets, and I think most people kind of understand that concept pretty inherently. I think where it gets kind of complicated is where you add in end-to-end encryption, which is not just communicating directly to the service and encrypting stuff for the service, but also encrypting stuff for the person that you actually expect to receive the message from or the data to. So instead of encrypting for a intermediary service like YouTube, you're actually encrypting for the person that you expect to access that video or read that text message. So I think that's where we get into a bit more of the complexity. I mean, for me, I think encryption allows you to get back some of what we gave over when we opened up the internet. Like originally, the internet was like this cornucopia of just open information. Everyone could read everything. And it was much less like having private conversations with individuals. And encryption actually gives us the power, like technically, to be able to get that back. Which I think is a really good thing for the future of the internet, because we're moving more and more of our life onto the internet, our private conversations, just like our day-to-day dealings, which we have an expectation of privacy for. So yeah, I mean, I think I'd wrap it up there, but that's probably my broad thoughts on the topic.
I love that you say we probably have an expectation of privacy for. I just want to flag for people in case they're unfamiliar. ISP just means internet service provider.
Yeah.
So that's your internet provider or whoever is actually connecting you to the internet.
Yeah, Telstra just
Yeah, and we can maybe talk a little bit about metadata as well when we get through some of these questions, because I think that's the way you guys approach it. I think to me is really interesting, because it's something that in Europe and across the globe, metadata is sort of seen as a free for all, in terms of like access by both, the technical services that connect us to the internet, but also by law enforcement and intelligence agencies. So. So before we just jump into the question, can you give us an overview of what is contained in metadata, like normally, like that people might not think is in metadata?
Yeah, so I think the technical definition is it's everything, like say we're talking about a message, it's everything in like that kind of is contained on the outside of the message, but is not the actual contents itself. So say I was talking to Lucie and I was saying hi. That's not metadata, that's the actual content of the message. But the time that I sent the message, my IP address when I sent the message, which is kind of like an identifier of your individual network address on the network. Lucie's IP address, there's other information like maybe it's connected to an account, for example. So that account that it's connected to, and yeah, it's basically everything that's outside. If you were to send an envelope or something, it's like having the sender address and the return address on the back. That's the metadata in this situation.
Yeah, I always think the envelope metaphor there falls short, because it's like as if you had, if the envelope had on it written where you wrote it, where you bought the paper, which post office you walked into, where you bought the stamp, the two stores you stopped on the way when you were. Like I always find it funny that we think metadata often is less sensitive, but actually some of the studies that I encounter through my work is, it shows just how accurate of a picture you can paint when you have all of that information about, where people are during their days and who they interact with, and things like that.
Especially when you go into like aggregating data from like metadata from multiple sources, like your IP address is something that tends to stay static for longer periods of time. It can be updated, but say if Google was collecting information about what you searched, but then Facebook was collecting information about like the profiles that you visited when you were on their website. If those get married together, then you can form like a very accurate picture of who someone is. And you can do a lot with that.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Well, I'm going to move us on to the next question, because I feel like I could talk about metadata and why it should be more protected forever. But Sam, if you will pop in the first, because it's a big one, the question that we got, and that was sort of the notion that there's no legitimate reason for law-abiding members of the community to own or use encrypted communications platforms. This is my favorite. What a whammy of a question this is. Do you have a response to that kind of a take? Because otherwise I can kick us off if you prefer.
Well, I mean, it's kind of like saying that there's no reason to have a private conversation in the real world. Like there's no reason that you should meet up with someone and have a conversation which isn't broadcasted to the entire world, which is just like, I can't imagine that being like even something that you would consider saying in the real world. But the online world, like we're doing more and more in the online world now. So we need these spaces where people can talk and feel like, not that the whole conversation that they've, talked with their friend isn't going to be leaked to some sort of third party who can read and analyze all of the text that was in that message. Like, yeah, but I think bringing it down into putting the analogy out there that like, if you were to have this scenario in the real world, you would be considered like a despotic state that was like, trying to read everyone's messages. This is not something that we do in real life. Like, it's crazy to me.
I mean, hypothetically, if they could, maybe they would.
Yeah, it's true.
I always think, look, ASIC and AFP, all of these sort of law enforcement or intelligence agencies, they have a very sort of single point view of the world. And so, to a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And I think they deal with so much with the criminal world and prosecutions that they tend to, it's not their job or a part of their mandate to explore how or why the internet needs to be open and private and what wonderful things, people are able to do through those channels. So I don't blame them in a way for these like hot takes that they shovel into the media, but I hate them because I always get like 1,000 calls from press and journalists, and I have to pull together the same set of like studies and things, and everything showing that that's simply not the case. And I actually think of it a little bit like if you are driving a car, like you're saying you don't need airbags and a seatbelt if you're a good driver. That's just not, that ignores the nature of the system. Like making it about an individual's choice ignores the nature, I think, of what the internet is, which is it is filled with threats and scams and identity theft and just all sorts of horrible things. I love the internet, don't get me wrong, but one of the great things about encryption becoming so ubiquitous is that really you have security. And so you're kind of pointing the finger at individuals and saying, well, why do you want the security if you're not a criminal? But the reality is there's just so much, people could be tapping that data to try and impersonate you. Certain governments or political parties who have anti-gay or, sort of anti-immigrant agendas or something could be trying to collect that information and use it against people. There's just so many different ways in which an insecure internet is bad for everyone. So I personally just have a lot of gripes with this question. And, we see the benefits of encryption too. I think banking and a lot of sectors that need confidentiality and privacy use it by default. Now a lot of government services use it. A lot of the trusted government or EID solutions that are being used around the world use encryption. So it's funny to me, and the governments themselves use encryption to transmit information.
Yeah,
that's how embassies communicate. So I find it funny when they're like, well, if you're not a criminal, why do you use encryption? I don't know. Why do you? Why do you guys? But yeah, and I guess I'll end. This is a conversation that's been had since literally the 90s. Because encryption used to be. Kee, I don't know how much you guys have encountered this, but in my work I have, and encryption used to be on the sort of controlled lists of export controls for the longest time. And for people who aren't familiar, export controls are a system which, let's call it what it is, that white Western governments put in place to restrict the flow of technology out throughout the world. And encryption was something that, we, in the US and in Europe, we didn't want the rest of the world to have because we wanted to spy on them better. That was, that when you read the documents back in the day of why those controls were there, that's what it was. And then we sort of went, with encryption, we sort of, mandated that it would be the weaker encryption, 128 bits. For a while, that was the standard. It was like you could have encryption, but it had to be the weaker encryption. And then now sort of we have robust standards because now we've shifted so much of our, banking and government and school and work and everything online that we actually really need this protection. So this statement is like based in just a lack of understanding of the environment. It's also based in a lack of understanding of Australia's own cybersecurity strategy, because when you read the threat landscape of that, like it's obvious that Australia needs encryption. It's facing a lot of threats, I think, continuously evolving. Anyway, that's it. Should I move us on to the next question, or do you have something to add to my angry rant?
No, I think that was a good explanation. Like
angry rant
topics there. Yeah, we haven't had so many issues with export laws, but I know that it was pretty intense. Like for PGP encryption, like in the 1980s or something. Like they tried to shut down the creators of like public key cryptography, which is just crazy. And then there was like this weird thing where it was like they printed the algorithm on like a shirt, and then it was like considered free speech in the States, like instead of being controlled by export laws. So yeah, that was interesting.
Yes, the internet activist always finding a way around. But yeah, so this is such a funny fight, and some states still like have those laws on the books, but they don't like enforce them. But I think it's funny because now like encrypted devices ship and sell from everywhere, and technically like in Hungary, you still need a license because anyway, let's forget about it. If you guys want to talk to me and be angry about export controls, it's one of my favorite topics in the world, so hit me up. Okay, we'll move on to the next question, which will pop up on the bottom of the screen through the magic of that is Sam. Thank you. And that is, hasn't encryption made it difficult for law enforcement to do their job? Ooh, yeah, I mean, guess depends. Kee, do you have a thought on this? Otherwise, I'll kick into another angry rant.
I would say it has, but it's not our job, like as private citizens who are using encrypted applications, to care about that. Like, you know, what we essentially gave them when the internet was created was this like massively open system where nothing was encrypted. Like you could just see all of the information that was flowing, like originally nothing, you know, like if you're an ISP in that situation, information was flowing through, you could just see like the plain text of what people were requesting or what people were doing on the internet. And that was amazing for police, you know, because they can just sit in the intermediary point and read everything that's going on. But that's not a reflection of real life. Like that's a temporary kind of aberration that we had on the internet. And now they expect that, like that, because that's what they've had before. They now expect that into the future, that all of the information that flows through the internet is going to be clear, and you know that they can see what's going on. Like, yeah, I'm sorry to say, but that was then, and this is now. Like we've deployed encryption across most of the internet now. Like, you're using it right now when you're watching YouTube. And I don't really think that it's our role to make police's job easier when they're trying to enforce the laws. They were able to enforce the laws before the internet was here, before we had information flowing over the internet. So they should still be able to enforce the laws now. It's about having like good policing techniques, right? About following things down in real life and not relying on these systems that you had before where you could just read everything that was going on. So yeah, that's a bit of an attack, but you know.
I actually love it. That's a really similar answer that I would give. I think it's you know, it's not our job as individuals to think through, am I carrying out my everyday activities in a way that is most suitable to law enforcement?
Right.
That is not a way I want anyone to think. It's not the way I want my children to think.
We could put cameras on our heads and like walk around all day, like streaming that information to the police like station, and it would make their jobs really easy. But that's not like how we live our lives, you know.
Not yet, Kee. Not yet.
Yeah.
I think that's true. What you're saying is, if we've developed almost, they've been able to develop this infrastructure around the way the internet was really open and insecure at the beginning. And now it's like by improving the security and actually, you know, trying to make the internet, also the internet's gotten like a whole lot bigger, right? Like it used to kind of be a US based place. Then there were a couple of servers in Europe and Russia. And so it's a much bigger place. It needs much more robust security. Now we like fight information wars and like state conflicts in online. And so in that environment, to, you know, say encryption is making law enforcement job difficult is like, I think it's tone deaf, because you have to be, again, cognizant sort of the entire threat environment. But also they can still do investigations. It's just more complicated than, as you say, kind of sitting there and looking at just content and content and content. And, you know, it's also something that's new over, let's say, 20, 30 years, right? Like policing, when kind of phones started, when phones started being a thing and everyone got a landline, they also were able to, you know, at that time, there was a really big conversation around confidentiality, because like in the post office, letters are kind of sacred. And at the time that was designed, because obviously otherwise anyone could open anything. And, you know, people understood the value of the like integrity of a letter being delivered from one person to another without, you know, being harassed or compromised. And then with phones, I think we had that conversation of, you know, because they realized, oh, if we could wiretap conversations, we could really like, you know, we could really speed up investigations if we can just listen to people commit the crime. And then, you know, a lot of the sort of laws of surveillance and communication surveillance are still based like a lot of them were drafted around 96. Right? Which is like a time when the internet was not what it is today. And now we have this sort of like huge global internet and we use it for work and all sorts of things. So it's really, I think, just a totally different place. And I think law enforcement actually, if anything, should be more interested in helping us stay secure and, and feel confident in using the internet rather than saying that this sort of security that we try to have is somehow hampering their efforts to do investigations. And there are a lot of other investigative means, I think, that they have at their disposal. They have a lot of sophisticated sort of tools and technologies that they can deploy where they really are chasing criminals and not just kind of proactively monitoring for criminal activity. Yeah. So hard agree. And which actually leads us really nicely to the next question. And I'm really curious about what you think of that. And that was submitted through the form. And that's, there's a lot of talk about backdoors. Could companies build backdoors for legitimate access?
I don't think so. The issue with creating a backdoor for legitimate access is that it can also be used by malicious parties as well. It's very difficult to build something just that so that law enforcement can use it. And then also, like, even if you're to completely sideline that question and say, like, okay, we developed like some system which doesn't exist, which only allows like law enforcement to view like content that's traveling through the internet. Like, do you necessarily always trust law enforcement like to be able to view all of the content that you're sending through messengers or content you're accessing on the internet? I don't think so. Like, I don't trust them to be able to only look at the specific information that the court has ordered them to look at. Or more realistically, they probably wouldn't get a court order and they just like dragnet surveil all of the information at once and then decide what's useful or not at a later point in time. But yeah, it's just like, I don't invite like police officers to like my conversations, right, that I have in real life. Like, I don't feel like the same thing needs to be done in the digital world. Like, it's just not necessary. They can, deploy, existing measures that they already have access to be able to get some of this information. So, backdooring, providing encryption backdoors for applications, not a good idea, in my opinion.
Yeah, it's funny that you mentioned dragnet surveillance because I always find it really frightening when I listen to like the testimony of like AFP and ASIC in Parliament, and for metadata retention, they were like, we kept that data, that they kind of requested in certain cases, just in case it's useful in like the future.
Yeah.
And I was like, what now? So you've got like a warrant or some sort of administrative approval. Warrants are not warrants in Australia anymore. You had some sort of approval for a case, you got the data, and now you're like sitting on it for the maximum allotted period in case it comes in handy. Oh God, I find that just incredibly twisted. But that's the mentality. And I think in dragnet surveillance, just to explain a term that is not maybe familiar for people, it's just, you sort of from fishing, you put the net down and you drag along, and it's very destructive for the marine environment, which I think is a very good analogy for what it does to the internet. But it just pulls in everything, and then they kind of sift through the data. And that's sort of what we see in the most recent proposals too, in Identify and Disrupt bill. We have network activity warrants, which do kind of precisely that, just let them sift through conversations where they have a suspicion there might be criminal activity. And I find that incredibly frightening, that they don't have to, have a concrete idea or proof. I think that really fundamentally shifts the way the judicial system should work in a democratic country. And I say that almost with quotes in the case of Australia. But yeah, just, in terms of backdoors, what you said is exactly sort of the case, that it can't just be built for good guys. And I think it's easy to, in a very simplistic view of the world, it's easy to be like, well, law enforcement should always have access. But, there's a lot of cases where they've, abused power or used that, power sort of maliciously and in ways we wouldn't want. Also, the world is not black and white. And a lot of times law enforcement is inherently used to prosecute whistleblowers or journalists or political dissidents. And so globally, I sometimes read the documents from like the European Union, and they try to list on like some of the sort of data sharing cooperation agreements. They'll like list law enforcement agencies or like appropriate courts from other countries, which they recognize as having like similar authority. And I always find that so funny to think. I'm like, people would maybe understand like Australian law enforcement, but I'm like, can you confidently tell me who in law enforcement in Malaysia, for instance, you would trust with like legitimate access, or who like in Azerbaijan you would give legitimate access to, like countries that actually prosecute or countries that actually prosecute minorities, and prosecute people for being gay. And I think it becomes a real, so when people have a very simple and very confident view of this, I think it's a very like white person view and confidence in the world and in a judicial system that just doesn't exist globally. It's my issue. Yeah.
Yeah, I just also I would add police are just they're people, right? And there's a lot of people in the police force. You're seeing with some of these metadata warrants, or not even warrants. I think there was a case 2 months ago where the police officer, he was domestically abusing his wife, and he used he used his access to the system to be able to look up her new address on her driver's license to be able to go and harass her. You've got to remember that the police that would have access to these backdoor, they're just people, right? And people are flawed. So there's going to be people who have access to this information who are not necessarily going to be using it for legal or legitimate purposes. And giving them that power is to be able to read every single message in the system. It's too much to give. It's too much access to give to people who are ultimately flawed, just like all of us. But that power shouldn't exist, basically.
Yeah, amen. And I always kind of refer back to the Edward Snowden book, Permanent Record, which I think is a fascinating read for anyone who's curious about how the internet went from being the weird little forums that people used to have chats on to being the internet of today. And he talks about love intelligence, which is a term in the US intelligence community where, so many officials actively used the surveillance infrastructure to spy on exes or, for friends, kind of look in on their partners and ex-lovers. And, it is such a part of human nature, I think, in a way, it's the reason we like to watch shows like The Bachelor. But it's such an inherent part of human nature. And I don't think they've done enough to address a lot of as you say, it still happens. And I often am very disappointed by the reaction in that community. So actually, and maybe that's the biggest issue with this. I think when people say legitimate access, they imagine a warrant and really catching some serious criminal, but really legitimate, what they mean by legitimate access is law enforcement access. And I think that's a problem because I think a lot of the times that's not legitimate. I think in Australia, we have very big conversations around things like that. Law enforcement raiding Anika Smethurst, who's a journalist, for certain types of coverage. I think you could come up with a lot of examples like that where most people, raise their eyebrows about what might be or might not be legitimate. I do have to move us along, but we get to kind of dig a little deeper into this. And that's, are there technical solutions that wouldn't compromise encryption and or privacy? I guess, are there technical solutions to accessing encrypted communications?
I would say no. I mean, the best way to design it would probably be to encode another key. You would encrypt for the person you expect to receive the message, and then you would also encrypt for the law enforcement key, and then you would give the law enforcement key to that law enforcement body, right? But the issue is what's the security around that key? If we give law enforcement that key and it somehow leaks out of government departments which have been known to have databases leak, it's happened various times, then that key is like accessible to everyone. Like, what happens if you have a state level actor, like China or something, that wants to read Australians' messages, and they get access to that key through a state-sponsored hacking event into the Australian Signals Directorate or whoever you would give this key. More likely, this key is going to end up on some sort of like very insecure like police computer, like in some like probably in like some regional like it'll go out, it'll permeate throughout the entire like police and enforcement system. And then anyone who gets access to that key has like permanent access to all of the messages that could be decrypted. So I think you could design a system to do this, but I can't see a system in where you don't have massive key management issues here.
Yeah, I would agree. And I think for me, the big issue is also we're really losing sight of who's under surveillance and who's not in a system where that, that's kind of cooked in like that, like whether it's, sort of backdoors or law enforcement having it, sort of this key escrow as it is known. I think that's like, if I'm under surveillance, I think at some point I have a right to know that I am or I have been under surveillance. I understand that sometimes it might hamper investigations, especially when they do big covert ones. But I think as a citizen in a democratic country, I expect a level of accountability from my government, and I expect to understand that my communications were surveilled as a part of some sort of an operation for this period of time. I think that's a civil liberties argument as well as a technical argument, right? And I'm sure Kee, you can appreciate that. Like, you want to know if your system has been compromised, right? And who might have had access for how long, and if that access was hidden, who else could have had access? And I think you get into sort of also trade secrets, and for certain people who work in sort of more high level jobs, I think that's even riskier, to be compromised like that. So that's such a huge gripe that I have with all of the laws that Australia keeps shoveling through, is that we've really made the infrastructure of these, network activity warrants and communication surveillance like invisible. And I take huge issue with that, because I think it really, the precedent that sets globally is terrifying. That law enforcement should have, sort of full discretion and full run over who's surveilled and who's not. And I find that frightening. But just to go back to this question, I think, there's a lot of things that law enforcement have at their disposal that lets them sort of surveil specific people. It's more expensive and more technically complicated. Like, they will use keyloggers, they'll use certain types of, spyware or malware that will collect data. Because of the level of intrusion of those specific tools, it tends to come with a lot more safeguards, and it tends to come with a lot more, paperwork and burden. So I kind of, we have a debate ongoing in the community of what's okay and what's not okay under this sort of term of government hacking. But I think they have a lot of different investigative tools available to them to pull information when they really need it. Same with using tools like Celebrite, which will decrypt information if they've seized devices as a part of a raid. But that is such an extreme step. And obviously we go back to what we were talking about, which is they really just want to read all communications and kind of proactively look for nuggets rather than actually do targeted investigations. And that's the fundamental struggle, I think, of these that these questions are hinting at. I think this one's kind of along the same line. So I'm gonna just jump ahead, Sam. I'm sorry. I'm gonna jump ahead to another question. But is encryption enough to protect people's security and privacy? And what else should we be focusing on in this space?
Yeah, so I spoke about that a little bit earlier. Encryption's kind of just one element to privacy, especially. Security, like a lot can be gained through encryption if you're encrypting for the right people in the conversation. It kind of goes back to this discussion of like For example, a good example is like a messaging system where you encrypt for the centralized server who stores all of the messages and then sends them to other people. In that case, an intermediary party can't read the information when you send it to the server itself. Like let's use Telegram as an example because they're an unencrypted messaging application. You encrypt for the Telegram servers, but the Telegram servers can read all of your messages that are on the Telegram servers themselves. So if they were to be compromised, all of your security in that sense would be lost. Now, end-to-end encryption is a higher standard because you're actually encrypting for the person that you expect to receive the message. So even if Telegram servers are compromised, you're actually getting all the way to the person that you expect to talk to, and Telegram won't be able to read what's going on in between. So that kind of provides security. If you're using end-to-end encryption, you're pretty safe on the security front. It doesn't necessarily provide privacy though, which is what we were talking about before with metadata. Because if the centralized server knows exactly when you sent the message, who you sent the message to, your IP address when you sent that message, which is going to provide information about like course location, and if they interact with your ISP as well, they can get your exact location, your address, your personal information as well. So metadata is a massive part of this, and obfuscating metadata is really important for maintaining privacy in communications, not so much security, but yeah.
So Kee, can I ask, so why don't more people do, why is metadata this free for all? Why haven't we been protecting it better?
I think there's two kind of aspects. There's the legal aspect to it, but I think it's not a dead end, but it's really hard to get effective regulation written for metadata because it just is so accessible by centralized server operators. Like if you're running a website, people have to connect directly to you to get information from your website, right? And when they connect directly to you, you have a copy of their IP address, when they connect to you. So it's more difficult than encryption, for example, where if I encrypt for the other person in the conversation, then the centralized server doesn't get any information. They can't read the contents in that scenario. I think, so that's the legislation arm. I think it's harder to write effective rules for companies to follow to not collect metadata. But on the technical stance, it's harder to get rid of metadata as well, because oftentimes you need to know some information, like the centralized server needs to know some information to route the messages that you're sending, for example, or the data that you're sending through them to the correct destination. So it's technically harder to remove it. You need to use system. You can't just encrypt something and then it's done. You need to use systems like onion routing where you're hopping your connection through multiple paths, or VPNs where you're connected to a location, you're sending all your data to them and then they send it to the person that you're interacting with. That technically is a much harder solution than just doing something locally on my computer where I make the data indecipherable to anyone who's not the person I expect to be receiving it. But I'd be interested to hear what you think on this as well, because you probably have more insight to the legislative side of things.
Maybe. Yeah, no, I do agree with that. It's something I struggle with because I think it's easy for some activists to just, and there are some people like that who will yell from the sidelines saying everybody should be using Tor and everybody should be using VPNs. But I think you have to be realistic about people's technical ability and skill level, and the way the internet works and is indexed. It requires certain technical things like metadata to be kept. So the ease of use, you have. We do something called threat modeling in these cases, and I think the ease of use for most users is sort of outweighed by some of the more technical privacy concerns that some of us might have with specific types of work. But legislatively, I find it fascinating because metadata is one of those things that and I think that's also leftover from the telephone drafting laws of the 90s were a real wild time when people drafted this sort of legislation. I think that's the leftover from that era where, and now you have these like robust sort of legal international agreements like Council of Europe, which is that's not the European Union, that actually involves countries like Russia, Azerbaijan, and a lot of other sort of European Balkans, and there's a cybercrime convention that like specifically talks about cross-border sort of requests for metadata, and metadata is always seen as like a lesser evil. And that's just, and I think when you have huge international standards like that have been sort of written into law so many decades ago, it's really hard to shift the conversation. And so the way that's kind of resulted and spun, I think metadata is then always seen by law enforcement as something that they should have sort of almost free access to. And so I deal a lot with these kind of cross-border arrangements, and that's always, metadata is always like a part of, it's the same actually with the Australian International Productions Order Bill, passed. And Australia is trying to get this agreement with the US to have better access to all the metadata stored by US tech companies, right, on US servers. So it's just a part of the ecosystem that really, like early on in the internet, got lost away from a conversation about privacy. And I think that's a really hard one to win, because it's so far baked into this international cooperation system that it would be incredibly hard to overturn. And nowadays, negotiating with countries like Russia is even more difficult. So I think almost we have to leave those behemoths standing, for better or worse, because ultimately the deal we would come to with Russia now would be just, I think, worse in many ways. But is to go back to this question: is encryption enough to protect people's security and privacy? No. It's such an easy pillar, though, that I find it frustrating that we have to keep arguing for it. I will do it till the day I die, but I'm not happy about it. But there's so much other stuff that has to happen in the background of our devices every day that ensures security and privacy. Companies spend billions trying to do that. There's a reason that data breaches are such a huge deal. There's a huge, and everything like server security. Just there's so much that needs to happen to ensure security and privacy online. But in terms of an individual security and privacy, I think encryption is a very easy, no-brainer sort of win in my book. That's how I see it. But what else should people be focusing on? Focus on updating your software. Update your software. Yeah. Okie dokes. Let's move on. And I'm also conscious we will try to wrap up. So I'm gonna move us on to the next question. And if actually, let's maybe just wrap, because I feel like some of these questions are so big. If we dig into them, we're just going to be here for another 10 minutes. I'm going to combine two in one, but Sam, you can just pop up the last question. And that is that all of it, this is a bit overwhelming and technology seems to be changing. Do you have any tips for people who are not highly technical or how to manage? And I think that's a key. How do you think through that of people who don't technically understand, who get overwhelmed by this a little bit? What are the easiest sort of things that they can hit?
It's pretty tough. I think you have to find some trusted sources, basically, people that you trust who will be able to analyze the information and make recommendations about, which applications you should be using, what the best security practices are. If you're not going to put in the effort yourself, then try to at least put in the effort to find people that you I think are trustworthy, essentially. And Digital Rights Watch would obviously be one of them. Prominent, I would say the prominent people in the space, like Edward Snowden, usually gives really good recommendations on what software to use. But yeah, it's all about kind of taking your situation seriously and just having, the way that it's been set up is kind of for you to fail. Like the system has kind of been set up for you to choose like the most insecure methods to use. And it's our responsibility, unfortunately, I wish it wasn't set up that way, but it's our responsibility to learn about some of these new technologies, or at least find trusted people that we can talk to about what methods we should be using to communicate online or protect our security and privacy. So yeah, do some searching, because there's definitely people out there that talk about this stuff every day, and organizations that are set up to, advance people's privacy and security. EFF is another really good organization that you could look into as well.
Yeah, we do a lot of, to be honest, we do a lot of talking with groups like EFF and others. There's always conversations that happen about what's changing in the environment. Like, I think a few years ago when WhatsApp went encrypted, that became such an easy, it became such a mainstream encryption tool that a lot of our sort of groups were like, yes, use WhatsApp. It's easy. You can still share images and videos and Giphies. And because some of the more technical tools, it becomes difficult to do that while still maintaining access. And I do like, WhatsApp, when your security code with someone changes, which is that's the application of encryption that you see, you get a little yellow message to say that. So I think that can be understated. The way that I think they rolled out end-to-end encryption for people was actually very user-friendly. It was the first sort of user-friendly application of communications encryption that I encountered, because before I was using PGP and in email. I would not teach that to my mom, but WhatsApp was an easy one for her to pick up. And, now sort of Facebook has ruined, as Facebook does with all things it touches, it's ruined WhatsApp. And so now I get a lot of questions from my friends, to be like, what should we be using? How worried should I be about this? And I still think for most mainstream users who are used to using WhatsApp, that's still probably the best channel, but I do try to have as many people now on Signal as I can. And so it does move, and things will change because of the nature of capitalism. Like, companies will get bought out by other companies. They'll change the business model. They'll change data sharing practices. If a certain country's laws change, and that's where the tech company is based, it does make you question the intent. And, I think Atlassian's been really clear on how many billions of revenue they've potentially lost out because of Australia's anti-encryption laws. As a tech company, those things will change. So I would say, stay in tune with, with whether it's Digital Rights Watch or EFF or any of the wonderful groups in our space who are doing this work. And we'll always point you to the tools and technologies that we're trusting. And I think that's the best, but also just keep your system updated. Don't click any links that you haven't solicited. I think those are really easy things that are to overlook, and that sort of basic conversation that you can have with your parents and grandparents. I'm looking at you all now because I know that we have like a younger audience, but it's actually the older generation. I think that's really at risk, especially from like banking fraud and stuff like that. So just have really simple conversations with them about, if you receive an email, doesn't mean that it's a trusted source. Like, you'll get emails from all sorts of fishy people. And so I think that's the easiest. And then, for people who are really concerned, there's technical help. Access Now, which my old company, NGO, sorry. They run a helpline, so you can contact them if you have like sophisticated security issues, or you're a journalist or an activist who's very concerned or has actual technical suspicions, maybe that your devices have been compromised. So there are resources for that. We share them regularly, and I'm sure OPTF and Digital Rights Watch are on the Twitter. So if you want more resources, tweet at us and we'll be happy to share them. Is that right? Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. Like we have a Twitter for OPTF, and also the session Twitter as well is often talking about changes in the landscape I mean, a good example would be Wickr just got bought out by Amazon. So that's definitely decreased like their level of trust in a lot of people's eyes. So that could be something that you might not know about unless you were kind of following along with how, how everything was panning out.
Do you want to give us a quick shameless plug on Sessions and where people can download it and why they should?
Yeah, so essentially Session is a fork of Signal. So if you're familiar with Signal, the experience is similar. We tend to focus more on anonymity. So there's no phone number required for sign up, which is a really important part of signing up for a messaging application for a lot of people, because phone numbers are often connected to your real world identity. And for a lot of people that can feel really, really unsafe for them. We also do a lot on the metadata side, which I was kind of talking about before, with a technique called onion routing, which hides your IP address, which can also be an identifier that is used by ISPs or network adversaries to work out who you're messaging or who you're talking to in the system. So yeah, if you're interested in the application, you can go to getsession.org, or we're on Twitter as well at getsession. And you can check us out. I've got my ID up on Twitter, so if you want to message someone, you can grab my ID and send me a few messages.
Cool, love it. Sorry, I wanted to give you the space to just familiarize people with that. That sounds great. Look, everybody, thanks so much for tuning in. We'll wrap there. I think we did our best with the questions. I'm sorry we didn't get to some of the last ones. I feel like we did cover them though, so I glazed over them because I think we did get into that, and the balance of privacy versus access. As I said, you can reach us on Twitter. Feel free to share this video. It will be on YouTube. We try to make those resources as accessible as possible. I think the pandemic has shifted us in a good way, in trying to make these just as available and as accessible for a long period of time. So feel free to share that around. And thank you so much for tuning in. And thanks, Kee, for joining me. I think this was a really great session. So thanks for being a pal. And we'll sign off now.
Thanks for having me. Thanks, guys.